In 1960, after I graduated from medical school, I had made up my mind that I wanted to go to a place for my residency after my internship where I would be exposed to research in a very meaningful way. And my mentor in medical school recommended that I look at the University of Minnesota. And at that time, I began in the Department of Pediatrics. The reputation of the Department of Pediatrics at that time was the finest in the country, bar none. And its faculty was considered to be particularly outstanding in every area, with a very extraordinary record of producing professors and leaders of departments in every discipline in academic pediatrics. So I came to Minnesota not having any idea about anything except the excellence of the institution, including all aspects of the medical school. So after a 2-year residency in pediatrics, I then went into endocrinology, at which time I began to be exposed to the clinical laboratory, which made a lot of sense because what I was doing in pediatric endocrinology was oriented towards the laboratory, particularly with respect to clinical patient-based research. I went into the Air Force for 2 years, and then at the Air Force I was learning a lot of techniques in the laboratory, actually. And interestingly, when I returned to the university as a junior faculty member, I was asked to consider to set up one of the few laboratories in the United States for children, infants particularly. So we set up what we then called the microchemistry laboratory adjacent to the intensive care unit for infants. And that introduced me to the laboratory and to the Department of Laboratory Medicine at that time, which was not the same thing as laboratory medicine and pediatrics. Laboratory medicine and pathology. Pathology was a separate department at that time. A few years after I began in that laboratory, Dr. Benson was going on sabbatical, and he asked me to be the interim head of the department during the year of his absence, which I did. And subsequent to his return, he made me the director of the clinical laboratories. And shortly after that, the medical school asked him to be the head of the department of a combined department of laboratory medicine and pathology, and that basically enlarged the scope of the department tremendously. What was particularly unique about the department at that time, and has continued in that vein to be one of the few departments of its sort in the country, is the depth and breadth and the involvement of the department in not only significant clinical aspects of medicine, but also pathologic and research aspects. So it's a very interesting department. During those early years, all of the departments in the medical school, in each instance, were considered to be the best in the country. Certainly amongst the top dozen in every single discipline. And as the place was what is generally called a intellectual ferment. People were not only doing a good job in terms of research and teaching, but they were constantly asking questions. And so all their students, which meant not only the medical students, but the residents and fellows, were all involved in asking questions as to why things were occurring with their patients, what was the mechanism, what could you do to improve the diagnosis, and what could you do to improve the care. So it was very innovative at every level. That pervaded throughout the whole educational program of the institution. Had been the case, actually, for several decades, even before the middle 60s and early 70s, with this extraordinary reputation. Ultimately, as time went on, my research career proved to be very pleasing and very successful. and I went through the ranks from assistant to associate and then full professor. I became very involved with many facets of the institution, including when the Board of Governors of the University Hospital was first created. I was a member of the finance committee of that board. I was very active nationally with respect to the National Institutes of Health on research study sections in pathology, and also with the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, at which I was the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board. I subsequently became quite involved with the Association of American Medical Colleges and became the chairman of the Council of Academic Societies. At that time, there were 3 different groups that came together under the umbrella organization. One of them represented the faculty as academic societies, the other were teaching hospitals, and the third was the deans of the medical schools. So I became very involved with both the scientific community nationally as well as the academic medical community. I subsequently became the dean of the medical school in 1984. And I must tell you, I was very privileged, and I remember at that time reflecting on my first impression, the first time I ever walked into the halls of the medical school. And incidentally, at that time, you couldn't distinguish the halls of the medical school from the halls of the university hospital. They were very tightly bound together. You physically didn't know when you were in one or the other, which is rather interesting if you think about it philosophically and functionally. That should have always been the case. So I reflected when I became dean on my first impression, which was in 1961. I was overwhelmed in awe of the institution, and then 23 years later, becoming the dean of the medical school, to me was something which I could never have envisioned, and I was extraordinarily privileged to be in that particular position. I kept on with my funded research for actually 6 years during the deanship, finally having to face the reality of not being able to do all that many things at once, and so I had to give it up. But fortunately, I had always maintained the habit of reading medicine as a hobby and reading science as a hobby. So I never felt removed at all from the mission of the institution or from the faculty, and I felt that they and I were truly peers, and we would be able to converse as equals without respect to any ranking or particular positions of authority or responsibility. I felt that the medical school should always continue to deserve the reputation that it had earned for the previous several decades of its existence. I also reflected on the fact that Abraham Flexner, who wrote a very, very important book about medical education in 1911, was talking about the future of medical education. And at that time, there were medical schools that had full-time basic science as well as clinical faculty. In his survey of the medical schools, he pointed out a few that, in fact, had already had that reputation, which included the University of Minnesota. He then also praised the university because it was about to get its medical school, its university hospital. Notice what I said, the universities and the medical schools hospital, not the hospital as a distinct entity. He made an important point that you had to have full-time academic faculty who were engaged in research or intellectual inquiry in order for the students to gain the perspective of always questioning whether or not what they were doing in medical practice was sufficient. Was a very wise judgment, because here we are practically a century later, and realizing that you must constantly ask questions. Various diagnostic or therapeutic procedures that used to be considered to be standard are no longer considered to be standard. We don't rely upon the same diagnostic measures. We don't rely upon the same therapeutic approaches because many of the ones that we had accepted were proven to be wrong. Had we not asked those questions, we would probably still be doing the same things we always had. That is exactly what Flexner had said in his very, very wise analysis of medical schools. He said that if a practitioner only knows what they did at the time when they graduated from medical school, then 30 or 40 years later they would be doing the same thing, which obviously is wrong. Now, furthermore, it's not sufficient for a physician to only accept what he is told to be the case. It must be a process of understanding what is happening. There's no way that you can properly relate to a patient or a patient's problem if you don't understand what's happening. I must say this is also something which is missing from the business sector of medicine, both with respect to insurers and organizations that parcel out patient care, parcel out the dollars for patient care. They have no clue as to how to ask questions of medical practice or to have judgments on what is appropriate in medical practice. So this aspect of what I referred to as intellectual inquiry has to be a part not only of medical education for people in medical school or nursing school or pharmacy or dentistry, but it also should be a very integral part of the understanding of medicine by anybody who has to be engaged in making patient care decisions. Nowadays, patient care decisions are frequently made in some respects by insurers and people who've had no medical education, which obviously represents a very important missing ingredient. As the nation is considering what kind of organization of healthcare delivery should occur, hopefully the concern that I expressed about asking questions, never being overly confident about what is right or wrong without understanding as to how things work and how mechanisms work and what diagnostic procedures are appropriate and why and how you make those decisions, we're going to end up with an inadequate medical care organization. So it's a crucial issue. Back again to laboratory medicine pathology before I go back into the dean's thing again, I must point out that laboratory medicine pathology has always attracted the best and the brightest, literally, through its residency program and through its specialty programs as well as in its faculty. The notion of having medical technology, pathology, clinical laboratory medicine, and experimental pathology and research is all a part of the department, has been the key to the success of that department. There are very few departments in the country that could claim that department's rich traditions and history. It also should point out that in contrast to the attitude that exists in some other institutions towards the people who run the laboratories is that they look upon the laboratorians as people who provide service, but not necessarily equivalent to the clinician in terms of their understanding of clinical medicine. That is not the case at the University of Minnesota, has never been the case. I think it is because of the rich traditions of research and inquiry and the excellence of its faculty and students that that department earns the respect that it has in the institution and throughout the country. So it's a wonderful starting point for an academic career. Back to the deanship. When I first began as dean, I needed to understand where the strengths and weaknesses were in the institution. I had the advantage at that time of being aware of many aspects of the institution, having grown up in it professionally. And I began to wonder where there were gaps or where there were strengths that needed to be developed. With respect to programs, I embarked upon several of them within a period of only 4 or 5 years, actually, from 84, I would say, to 87 or 88, which led to the creation of the Neurosciences program, the Human Genetics Institute, the MD PhD program, biomedical ethics, the development of the Cancer Center, and the development of the program in developmental biology as well. In addition, I was surprised to learn that there had been no planning for enlarging or changing the facilities for the basic sciences, which led us to seek the funding for the basic sciences building. That was really an uphill battle because the university was concerned that we would be detracting from the ability of the university to gain resources, as if to say paradoxically that what was good for the medical school wasn't good for the university. That was a peculiar attitude that I never understood. Frankly, I still don't understand it. The top flight universities look upon their medical schools as an asset, not necessarily as a deduction from the rest of the institution. That is a somewhat bizarre perspective that defies my understanding. But nonetheless, we persisted and were able to raise the money through extensive lobbying in concert with the biomedical community, private biomedical community in the metro area in the state, and we were able to build the basic science building. We also were able to develop the Center for Magnetic Resonance Research, which didn't exist before, and that, of course, is one of the premier programs in the institution at the present time. That also led us to build a building for that, which has been subsequently relocated in a different part of the campus, but many of the outstanding clinical research programs of the institution are based upon the work that's done in the Center for Magnetic Resonance Research, for which I'm very pleased. Well, then the time came when it was important, having begun the development of a cancer center, it was very important to find a facility to develop the cancer center. We wanted to embark upon a totally private fundraising without any monies from the state or the university. Again, I came across resistance, which I didn't understand from the university. Not that we were asking for any money, we simply wanted their endorsement. And we had to argue with some faculty groups throughout the university because they were concerned that if we developed the cancer center, it would detract from their ability to raise money. So we overcame the resistance from other parts of the university, including the then central administration, and were able to raise the funds to develop the Cancer Center and its program. Under John Kersey, who became its director, the Cancer Center was successful in becoming a National Cancer Institute Diversified Cancer Center, which is obviously another very important premier program for the institution. We recruited several department heads, and obviously every one of these programs that I was mentioning had to have its recruitment as well, and the medical school was doing quite well for a long period of time, and I was very pleased. We were growing in terms of our research. At that time, the medical school ranked 15th in the nation, including public and private medical schools, for funding from the National Institutes of Health, which meant that we were certainly amongst the top 5 or 6 of the public institutions at that time. In about 1992, we were visited by some people from the Food and Drug Administration telling us that there were concerns that they had had with respect to the production of what was referred to as Minnesota ALG anti-lymphocyte globulin. And I knew that the program existed. I knew that it had a great deal of respect internationally, and in fact the product that it made from horses was actually used throughout the world to prevent transplant organ rejection, and was very successful. Well, apparently there had been some communication over the previous few years directly with the Department of Surgery, with which we were not aware, that dealt with the questioning about whether or not they should or shouldn't be charging for that particular product. At that time, questions were also raised from still unknown people from the outside, questioning whether or not, in fact, this was a safe drug. So between all of the questions that were raised with respect to the finances and the safety, very extensive investigations were undertaken at the state level, by the university itself, and obviously in conjunction with the FDA, which created quite an uproar and throughout not only the institution but the community. The newspaper latched onto this with vengeance and made a major case of it. That led to the resignation of the head of the Department of Surgery. It so happens that subsequently there was no evidence of any harm that had been done to people because of the drug. There were no deaths that were attributable to the drug aside from the complications that inevitably occur in patients who require transplants. In addition, there was never any evidence of falsification of information, despite the fact that that had been alleged. I found myself in a very peculiar situation. First of all, it's important to recognize that in 1992, there was not all that much dissemination of information about the mechanisms by which the FDA operated. And coming at the responsibility originally as a faculty member and the dean of the medical school, I and most other deans of medical schools were totally unaware of much of the details of how the FDA operated. Paradoxically, I'm not so sure people still know how the FDA operates. But nonetheless, we learned very quickly as to what was happening. There was a big uproar in the university. Oh my goodness, how could this happen? And as a result, that also led to a federal trial of Dr. Najarian, which I testified, not on behalf of anyone. And he was found not guilty on all counts. Obviously, I was pleased, as was he with that. By that time, he had also been removed as head of the department and had a change of his academic status. I was under a great deal of stress at the time. Everything under the sun was being investigated. There was a huge amount of pressure. The vice president for health sciences at that time resigned because of a philosophic dispute with the central administration, and an interim vice president was appointed, and I was sort of at the end of the limb, which was a limb which was not particularly supported by the university at that time. I could not understand how I, coming up as a academician, researcher, patient care provider, and teacher, got involved with these kinds of matters, which were way beyond my expertise. But nonetheless, that led me to resign as the dean of the medical school. I felt it was regrettable not only because of my own concerns and feelings, but I felt that the medical school needed an advocate. And that advocate had to be willing to go against the grain in order for the institution to be able to prosper, as I have already recounted. So that although I did what I had to do, and it was the right thing for me to do personally, I felt at that time, and frankly subsequently, that that was not good for the institution. And the historians are going to have to wrestle with whether or not that particular period of time ends up corresponding with a change of the national perspective of the institution. Nonetheless, I was very fortunate to have extraordinary support, not only from my family, which was crucial, but also, interestingly, from the faculty of the medical school. And so I was welcomed back into the medical school as a true colleague, not as a burden. And so I resumed my responsibilities in laboratory medicine and pathology, both with respect to clinical chemistry as well as teaching laboratory medicine. I subsequently became the director of the General Clinical Research Center for the institution. I became a member of many committees and interestingly became chairman of a committee to be involved with the early investigation of alleged misconduct in research, and resumed some very active roles with national research organizations, including the National Institutes of Health. As I became very involved with a NIH-funded program, national program, in the prevention of type 1 diabetes, and found myself re-immersed again in a very productive and happy career in teaching, patient care, and research, which is what I intended to do many years before when I came to Minnesota. So I was able to roam the halls of the institution with a smile on my face, with what I felt was a good feeling of respect and accomplishment. About 2 years before I retired, or actually 2 years before I announced that I intended to retire, I began to think about the future. And I always had the perspective that one should not enter into a new realm because of negative aspects or negative perception of where they had been. That there should be something positive that attracts you, that's as exciting for you as what you had done at its prime. And so I began to think about what that might be, but actually it was more important to act than to think about it. And I realized at that time that I had a passion for art. And as time went on, the passion for art began to grow, and it gave me a great deal of satisfaction. So having been successful now in the previous parts of the academic career, the General Clinical Research Center, the head of pediatric endocrinology, very engaged in national scientific groups, pleased with teaching, ecstatic about patient care, I decided that I should look towards the future with as positive a perspective as I had in 1961 when I came to the university. So with that in mind, I resigned my administrative responsibilities, began over a 2-year period of time, and I didn't want to drag it out, to pull back from all the responsibilities. And so in December of 2004, I formally left the university and embarked upon a very wonderfully rewarding, pleasurable career in art. I love to read medicine. I continue to subscribe to 7 journals, which is several journals fewer than I had when I was active in career. But after all, when you've invested 40 plus years of your life in learning, there's not much sense in not continuing with it. And so I get a great deal of pleasure of feeling comfortable with understanding and at least intellectually participating in contemporary medicine. And medicine and art are actually good partners. So it's a great life, and I'm looking forward to even more accomplishments. In the last couple of years, I embarked upon sculpting, which has been also wonderfully challenging. I really knew nothing at all about how to create anything in the third dimension. And that is an interesting challenge with all kinds of new possibilities for creativity. I have very strong opinions about the university and where it's going, but I also realize that it is a natural human tendency that people who are more actively responsible for running large institutions take on their own perspective and are less concerned about what others may think of it. So I have to force myself to withdraw from expressing my opinion. I must say, however, that the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology continue to prosper. I continue to be as proud of that department as I ever have been, and the future is bright for me personally, with looking back towards the past with fond memories.